Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Immortal Game of Mikhail Tal. This is the most requested video I've gotten recently. Do more chess analysis of Tal. For many, he is their favorite player. He's the world champion in 1960, 1961. Definitely one of the most aggressive world champions we have ever seen. Didn't matter if he was sacrificing queens or all of his other pieces. He was always on the attack. Said that chess, every single game to him was like a poem, and he was the poet. And he was just a magician on the chessboard. So I thought, hey, let's go ahead and look at his Immortal Game, because you know, if he has a lot of good games, his Immortal Game is going to be a good one, and it is. So hopefully you enjoy it as much as I do. This game in particular comes from 1965. It's in the Candidates tournament. He's in the semifinals. His opponent is Bent Larsen. Mikhail Tal has the white pieces. And in the Candidates tournament, in the semifinals, at this time, they played 10 games, best of 10. And this is going into the 10th game, and they are tied. Now, Mikhail Tal has the white pieces, and so he does need a victory here. And he waits till the very end for the gem of the tournament. The winner of this round goes on to face Bxf5 in the finals of the Candidates tournament. So we'll go ahead and get started with Tal's Immortal Game. Starts out with e4, c5, the Sicilian defense, knight to f3, knight c6, pawn to d4 here after the exchange, pawn to e6, knight c3, and then d6. This is the Scheveningen variation in the Sicilian defense. I have a separate video on this variation if you want to check it out. I have a link in the description below, as well as at the end of this video, there will be a thumbnail you can click on if you want to check that out. But white plays a bishop to e3, knight to f6, just development moves from both sides, and then f4. Now, this is not the most common way that white plays, especially in 1965. Bishop to c4, preparing to castle on the king side. You have bishop e2, a little quieter move, but still safe. And then castle on the king side. Mikhail Tal not looking to do that. He's looking to play extremely aggressive, so he plays f4. So he's gotten his dark square bishop out. He now plays f4, which is the Tal variation, named after himself. He's now looking to castle on the queen side. He just has to get his queen involved into the action. So after bishop to e7, preparing to castle on the king side, we see queen to f3, and then both sides castle to opposite sides of the board. Now, usually when you see this in chess, it means that it's going to be a very aggressive game. Both sides can throw everything they want at their opponent's king and not have to worry about sacrificing king safety. Usually, if both sides are castled on the same side, you're not going to see pawns pushing up the board, because that's just putting more pieces further up, extending what we call putting air in front of the king, not as safe. Castled opposite sides of the board, you don't have to worry about that. So queen comes to c7, looking to start attacking on the queen side, and then knight to b5. Now, the queen comes back to b8, but this is a pretty tricky situation to analyze. And this is something that, as you're getting into chess openings and learning what variations you want to know, you can start to see where, if you don't really understand all the threats, it can get pretty tricky. So this knight and this rook are both attacking this pawn here on d6. So you can't just play queen to a5, start to attack on the queen side here, because just knight takes on d6. The bishop takes, yeah, the rook's just going to take right here on d6. White's up a pawn in material. Even if they don't take, maybe they just try to add more pressure here, rook to d8. Okay, well, just now pawn to e5. This is a great outpost for this knight. It's just not really going to work out. So we can see already that the queen needs to hold on to this pawn here on d5. But also queen to d8 actually doesn't work because of the move pawn to e5. The pawn can't take, because then this rook takes here on d8. The queen falls. You can't just push forward here, because then the knight's going to fall here on f6. But then also, you don't just want to play knight to d5. You're still going to end up losing material. Knight takes here on d5. You take our own knight, that's fine. We could play pawn takes on d6, attacking the bishop. They could play bishop to f6, and you just take the pawn right away. Or even if they just take the bishop, that's fine. But then rook takes here on d5. And you can see white's up a pawn in material. Now a lot of pressure on the opponent. This bishop here on d6 is pinned down. Not very good. So at the end of the day, Bent Larsen plays correctly and brings his queen back here to b8. Now that he stopped the immediate threat of the queen attacking on the queen side of the board, he decides it's time for him to start attacking. So he starts pushing with G4, A6, kicking the knight. Knight comes back here to D4. There's an exchange in the center of the board. B5, starting to attack on the queen side. Pawn up here to G5. Knight comes back D7. And then bishop to D3. This is lining up for the light square bishop to attack this H7 square, which is a weakness, only being defended right now by the king here on G8. Black decides to go ahead and start pushing on the queen side himself, and that is pawn to B4, and partly because he probably did not expect the next move from Tal. Remember, this is one of the most aggressive players of all time, and his brilliance many times wouldn't even cross someone's mind. In this position, he plays the move knight to D5, which is very difficult to find if you're playing even over the board and you have tons of time to analyze the position, because it's so rare that people are just giving up material for a stronger attack later in the game. But that's exactly what Tal does here. There's an exchange, gives up his knights. He exchanges with his pawn here just to open up for his light square bishop. This also has this almost imaginary line here on this D file and opens up this E file that he can start to attack, but really wants to get this light square bishop lined up at this H7 square, and decided, you know what, this knight here on C3 was really just playing defense. And so if I can take this pawn away, that's enough for me, because it's not always in chess how much material you have, it's how much material you have involved into the game. Tal knew that better than anyone, and he saw this position, said, I have my bishop pair here, I have some open lanes here, and I have a completely open file. I can have both my rooks, my bishops, my queen all lying down on my opponent. That seems better than what my opponent has going on. So we have Black push forward with F5, knowing that he has to counterattack in some way. Could have also tried maybe G6. This seems like a reasonable option for Larsen, but played F5 here, and then Rook to E1, attacking the bishop here on E7. The bishop's under attack here on E7. Black responds with Rook to F7. Now this Rook is being overworked. It's defending this bishop here on E7. It's also defending this pawn here on F5. But Tal looks at this and says, it's not wise for me yet to go ahead and take this material here on F5, because now the knight can come back to F7. It's still, this rook still attacking this bishop here on F5. But now maybe bishop to E6, or maybe they don't want to exchange, because after bishop to E6, you could see the knight come and take here on E6. And then maybe there's an exchange. Rook comes down here to F5. But maybe instead the bishop comes back here to D3. Well, in that case, now the bishop can take here on G5. The pawn can't take because it's being pinned down by the rook right here. So white's in this tough spot, maybe rook to G1. This is not necessarily where Tal wants to be. And he wishes he had more pawn attack on the king side of the board. And so he analyzes this position and says, yes, this rook's being overworked, but first I need to start pushing more with my pawn. So he plays pawn to H4. Now bishop to B7, and now is when he recognizes that this is the opportunity to attack here, because the bishop here on C8 was doing a good job of indirectly defending and attacking this square here on F5. As soon as it moves, white can pounce immediately, and he plays bishop takes here on F5. Now it's a little bit different as before. Now if we were to see knight to F8, well, now we could see bishop takes on H8. This is very different because of this pawn here on H4, because you can start to push up the board. Maybe we have king takes here, pawn to H5, very different than before where we did not move that H pawn earlier. So we see in this position, we don't see knight come to F8. Instead, Larsen takes with his rook here on F5, and then the rook takes here on E7. Black continues with knight to E5, and the pawn can't take because it's been being pinned down by this rook here. He could take with his bishop, but really doesn't want to give up more material. He wants all of his material on the board to continue the massive attack that he has going on with this king side attack. And so instead he decides to play queen to E4. removing his queen from the pin. So now he can take with his pawn if he wants to. And black responds with queen to f8. Now this is getting the queen to the side of the board where all the action's going on. That's the king side, but also attacking this rook here on e7. But guess what? Tal does not care. He'll give up any material on the board. He says, oh, you want my rook? That's fine. I already gave up a knight earlier. You can take my rook if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and take with my pawn here on e5. Now, if you look at it, you say, why don't you just take the bishop here on b7? But things get tricky with rook to f4. Is attacking the queen here. You can't just take the rook. Maybe queen to e3. Still holding on to the bishop here on d4, which is now being attacked. But this is going to lose. Rook down here to f1 check. There's an exchange. Queen down f1. King to d2 checkmate right here. So that's not going to be good. If the queen moves to maybe e2. Okay, well now you just lose your bishop here on d4. And you already took the bishop here on b7, so you could get creative. You could play rook takes on g7, check after the king takes, bishop takes. Now this is better for white, but all of a sudden you're still in a horrible position. You're down a rook. You do have a pawn advantage, but you know Tal's going to lose this game. So he recognizes, you know what, I'm not going to take that bishop over here. It's a poison bishop. I'm going to go down the material. So instead, I'm just going to give you my rook if you want. I'm going to take your knight here. I'm going to give you my rook. I don't need it anymore. And so that's what he does. But Larsen looks at it and says, you know, I don't necessarily want that rook. I think things are going to go poorly for him. I'm going to first attack your queen here on e4. I can always come back and get this later. Queen to e3 still holds on to that bishop on d4. Rook down to f3, attacking it again. Queen down e2, and now we do see the rook come off the board on e7. Queen takes here on f3, and then pawn takes. Rook over here to e1, pinning down the pawn to the queen. So many tactics going on in this game, so many pins going on, so many sacrifices, very, very complicated positions that Tal somehow comes out of it on every single one in a better spot than he was before. So this pawn really like to take this bishop. It cannot, so swings the rook over here to d8. Rook takes here on e5, attacking the queen. Queen to d6 here, and then queen to f4. Saying, yeah, you're in a tough spot here. This actually protects this pawn here on d5, because you may look and say, well, how does that work? You have the queen, the rook, and the bishop all lining down on this pawn on d5, but let's say the bishop takes here on d5. Well, now just rook up here to e8, check. Pretty much have to take with the rook here. Now the queen is going to fall. So while black does have 3 pieces lined up on this d5 square, this queen to f4 move actually protects that pawn. Now Larsen plays rook to f8, attacking the queen. Queen comes back to e4, centralizing that queen. But you can see Tal's doing a good job of having all of his pieces work in harmony. Also has a pass pawn here on d5, the only pass pawn on the board. But all his pieces in the center are all working together, where black's standpoint, he plays b3, but none of his materials really working together. He's just holding on for dear life, but there's just not much left here. So pawn takes, rook down f1 check, king to d2, queen to b4 check, but that's pretty easily stopped with c3. And then after queen to d6, Tal has the finishing move, and that is with bishop to c5. And why is that such a good move? This is a great deflection. Pretty much any tactic that you read about in chess, Tal has done it in his Immortal game here. But this is a nice deflection, getting this queen away, giving up material. He's already given up a knight, a rook. What's a bishop here? After the queen moves, you can see rook e8, check, rook here to f8, and then queen to e6. And this is where Tal was trying to get this queen away from. It's protecting that e6 square. This is check. Then after the king to h8, then queen to f7. The reason this is so dangerous and why Larsen resigned in this position is this queen here on f7, the rook can't take it. It's being pinned down by this rook here. It's going to, the king is going to fall, but also this queen protects not only this pawn here on d5, but also the pawn here on f2. There's no additional squares that Larsen can go to pose any threat, and so he recognizes the end is near, and he decides to resign. So Tal's game, fantastic player, so aggressive, always sacrificing material, looking for a strong attack. So hopefully you enjoyed watching this video. If you did, if you wouldn't mind, please hit the like button. Also, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, if you wouldn't mind leaving a comment below and then putting a smiley face at the end of your message, I would appreciate it. That lets me know who actually made it to the very end. If there's other famous games that you want me to analyze, you can let me know in the comments below. This video was created because so many of you said do more videos on Tal, so that's why I did it. Happy to do others upon request. But thanks so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time.